Today, as you're going back through your drafts and doing some revising, I want to focus on the concept of explaining evidence. And I want to review some of the things we already learned about this and look at a new example today. I actually think explaining evidence is probably the most important skill that you need to develop and demonstrate in this unit. It's really the key to writing a strong position paper. So let's make sure we're doing it as well as we can. Now, remember from position paper number one, when we talked about explaining evidence to begin with, there are a few things that effective writers need to always make sure they're doing. Number one, make sure the reader understands what's being presented. That means when you bring in a quotation or a paraphrased piece of evidence, your reader needs to literally understand it. So, this actually, it sounds simple, but it's actually requiring a little bit of critical thinking on your part. Remember, I told you it doesn't always need to be literally explained. If your evidence is, quote, 85% of teenagers report playing violent video games, end quote, then you don't need to follow that with something like this evidence shows that 85% of teenagers play violent video games. No, that's just repeating it, and your reader already understood it in the first quotation. Instead, you need to look at it and say, I pulled this evidence from a larger piece, and maybe it's missing a little bit of context. Is there something I can add here to explain it in a way that my reader will understand what it means in a way they can't right now on its own? That's what you need to look at. Also, sometimes it's true. Yes, there is terminology or phrases in there that are quite complicated, and in that case, yeah, you can decide if you need to sort of translate some of it for your reader. That's a great skill, but it's an important thing to do. So make that determination first. How much do you need to translate for your reader? And then move on to these second 2 points, which are pretty key. You got to make sure in your explanation that you are showing how this evidence supports the point of this paragraph and, of course, supports your overall claim. Um, and you want to make sure that you angle it to be as persuasive as possible. What I mean by that is be creative, be skillful in your own language um, while you're explaining this evidence so that your reader is kind of convinced that that evidence is directly connected to your point and is certainly supporting your argument and the reason that you are developing in this paragraph. So again, these are the three key things. They seem fairly simple, but there's actually a lot you need to do as a writer. And I'm going to sort of add one more thing in your mind. Each body paragraph has multiple pieces of evidence. So you also, while you're doing this explanation, you kind of want to be thinking about the other pieces of evidence in your paragraph and making sure you're not repeating things and also making sure you're making connections for your reader where you need to. So that's why I want to go back to the example we had and start by looking at our really sort of simple outline for the body paragraph. We had a topic sentence: violent video games can help kids develop pro social skills like leadership and teamwork. And then we had two pieces of evidence we knew we were going to get to, which we were interested in because it allowed us to focus on the skill of cooperation. And the second piece of evidence here, which we liked because it talked about leadership and other socialization skills. So as a writer, I'm remembering that I want these two pieces of evidence to complement each other. Let's go back to the paragraph that this writer um, started, and let's look at how the topic sentence connects to the first piece of evidence with a great bit of introducing. It's easy to focus only on their violent aspects, but video games can also help kids develop pro social skills like leadership and teamwork. In many, quote, shooter video games, people create a team so they can work together on achieving the same goal. They communicate and share their strategies so each member of the team can understand what they'll do in the specific place and time in the game. When kids are playing on a team, they learn how to help each other if any danger is near a player from their team. Therefore, according to the American Psychological Association, people who play video games, even if they're violent, that encourage cooperation are more likely to be helpful to others than those who play the same games competitively, a 2011 study found. So that's where we're at. I'm going to get rid of the first part of that and just focus on the evidence that we just introduced. And I'm thinking already about the second piece of evidence that I need to get to. I'm going to have to make a bridge from here to here, and I need to start by explaining the evidence that I've presented. So, how can I explain this short quotation here in a way that sets me off on a path to move to this one? Let's look what this student did. Most concerned parents might find this to be a surprising finding, but it should not be overlooked. Teaching children to be the kinds of people who help others is an important but difficult task. And knowing how to be helpful is not only valuable in video games, but also for times when a person needs to be social or make a good impression on someone. Staying social is a vital part of succeeding in general, and video games are a great way of doing so while teaching players important lessons along the way. So, again, we're talking about encouraging cooperation. We're talking about how the video games do that. And this writer explains it, makes an interesting point here to say that, look, parents might be surprised that even violent video games can build this, but then they expand on the idea of cooperation and helping other people and why that's important. This starts to be very persuasive to me. They're explaining why we care about these skills, not just that these skills are available to in the video games that kids are playing. So, when you're looking at this example, pay attention to some of the moves this writer makes. Now, we also know that they want to get to this quote here next. So, even though this is not technically explaining evidence, I did want to show you how this writer went from their explanation of the first piece of evidence to bridging to this one. So, they say staying social is a vital part of succeeding in general, and video games are a great way of doing so while teaching players important lessons along the way. And now we want to get to this quote about socialization and leadership. So, what did they write? Not only that, but some of these lessons can teach players key skills related to teamwork and even leadership. This is shown in a study conducted by Stanford University. Oh, good. Now they're introducing the source as well as the quote, in which researchers found that, quote, multiplayer games become places where players can learn socialization skills, as they're places where decisions need to be made quickly about whom to trust or reject and how to lead a group. And that's where I'm going to stop this example for now. It'll be available for you to look at more closely if you'd like. The key thing to remember, those three most important points, when you bring in the evidence, does your reader understand it? Do they understand what's being presented? Do you need to translate it? Or more importantly, do you need to explain specific terminology or phrases? Or can you just move on to showing how it connects to your overall point, angling it to be as persuasive as possible, perhaps by sort of developing some of the ideas there and explaining to your reader why those ideas are so important and how they support your argument. So, now that you've looked at this example and been reminded of some of the things you need to do when you're explaining evidence, go back through your draft and make sure each time you bring in a quotation or a paraphrased piece of evidence, you are doing what you need to do to explain it effectively.